Hello and welcome to A Sad and Lonely Constellation, Panel 2. If I foresee that I will write a book about Hegel, then I will write a book about Hegel. Autonomisation of reason and philosophical systematization. Now giving the mic to Andrea.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming here. This is ASALC19, and this is the second panel where we'll be introducing 4 of the panelists that I called today. To introduce this panel, I will briefly explain its title, and I will provide a very short historical context of the contemporary debate around the topics mentioned in it. If I foresee that I will write a book about Hegel, then I will write a book about Hegel is a quote of Robert Brandom, one of the foremost American pragmatists. The sentence is taken from its quick book, Articulating Reason, published in 2000, with which he aims to give a clarification of his complex masterpiece, making it explicit, published 3 years earlier. Here, Brandom makes his thesis clear. Semantic content, the meaning of something, is determined by the norms governing inferences to and from it. And formal logical vocabulary should be understood as something that allows us to make our inferential commitments, something which follows from a statement, explicit. Within philosophy, reason has been described in 2 ways. On the one hand, epistemically, on the other, instrumentally. The instrumental approach systematically accomplishes the targets and the intents set out by a specific relation between thinking and its surrounding. Science, for instance. Instead, the epistemic approach focuses more on mapping each belief, model, system to their respective targets and on the efficiency of these cognitive and semantics maps. Brandom defined the nature of these achievements or commitment in his terms as inferential. German mathematician David Hilbert advanced the following yes-no problem. Given a formal logical statement, can an algorithm prove the universal validity of that statement? In other words, can an algorithm prove a statement's validity using the same inference rules that produce that same statement? In 1936, in 2 different papers, Alan Turing and Alonzo Church answered to this question by defining what computation is. The Church-Turing thesis about the description of computable functions refers to a combination of 2 abstract machines. There is a function computation machine, also known as lambda calculus, and a finite state-based machine, also known as Turing machine. Church showed that a general solution to Hilbert's problem is algorithmically impossible. That means that we cannot solve Hilbert's problem in a finite time. Following this, Turing exhibited that the algorithmic insolvability of his halting problem, which is another case among all the decision problems listed by Hilbert. The halting problem questions whether a program will terminate or not. By introducing this Church-Turing thesis, it can be argued that computable functions could not be captured by a formal axiomatic system. Thus, computation was defined as something in constant need of verification and always sensitive to falsifiability. The insolvability of Hilbert decision problems is also linked to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which profoundly influenced both Turing and Church 5 years before they published their papers. Thus, Gödel's metalogic reported incompleteness and inconsistency of Whitehead and Russell's Principia Mathematica. Whitehead and Russell's project was aimed to display how a specific set of axioms could generate all mathematical theorems through inference rules. Gödel then proved that it is impossible to find a set of axioms for all mathematics. However, instead of dismissing this axiomatic method, after Turing and Gödel, logicians and thinkers renewed their enthusiasm toward this tendency. They are heuristically generating new axioms and constructing new systems, new models, new words. In the same way, Thomas Neubert suggests that a toy universe in which various non-local cosmic phenomenon might emerge simply by interpreting current theories axioms. Also, this refers to what Reza Negarestani has called the toy philosophy. Following the developments in computational theory and informal logic, the pressures which are endured by various types of intelligence arising. An example, sorry, an example of this kind might be offered by the enterprise behind artificial general intelligence, that is the AGI. There is a kind of artificial intelligence capable of performing human tasks or capable of experiences, consciousness, and awareness. This kind of intelligence convolutes a mixture of computational and functionalist features. If we follow Brandom, an AGI implies a fundamental idea. The practices of entities capable of using speech and doing action define the same entities as rational, sapient, and autonomous. This explains why Brandom and his pragmatism, there is a special kind of functionalism, avoid talking of basic regularities reducible to patterns of stimulus-response behavior. Finally, in this manner, systematizing the word refers to an important philosophical practice in which, by reflecting upon the context and the use of a multiplicities of concepts, one is not only aware of the world, which should not be interpreted as a nominal entity, but also they can gain a certain kind of agency and semantically shape its own environment. So far, I've described some feature of my current standpoint, which is, as you can imagine, very influenced by Brandom, Negarestani, and also Daniel Sasselotto, who will speak fourth today, and others. However, among the speakers, there might be some dissenting voices, or rather than fervent adversaries, I would call them thinkers who work in the same theoretical terrain, and they either have proposed different perspective or have felt the urge to make this conception inherited mostly by Kant and Wilfried Sellars, if you will, more robust. In fact, some of today's speakers will talk about contemporary developments of Naturphilosophie, nature philosophy, a philosophical study of nature that began and evolved mainly in Germany between the end of the 18th century and the first 30 years of the 19th century. Against the Cartesian dualism, the main leading figure of this philosophical movement, Friedrich Schelling, argued that philosophy is generative to the extent that philosophizing about the nature means creating nature. Now I'm going to present each speaker's abstract, and then I will leave them discuss their research. Enrico Monacelli, who is on my left, recently graduated at University of Milan. In the contemporary debate concerning post-human and non-human intelligence, Enrico will argue that humanism has conceptualized in a truly radical way the possibility of inventing a descriptive model for non-human forms of intelligence, marked by a stark rationalism, a turn towards a full revelation of the humanist project, and a fruitful reevaluation of the neo-pragmatist tradition. According to Enrico, humanism is the best philosophical attempt at constructing a post-human description of intelligence. Nonetheless, taking inspiration from contemporary brand of pragmatist Hegelianism, he describes intelligence in strictly two dualistic terms. There is, on one hand, the sentience, and on the other, sapience. History and history of history. Therefore, Enrico will underline that this model is highly dysfunctional when describing the actual intelligenic process, which is a continuum of experiences, perception and abstraction, rather than an ensemble of discrete entities. To challenge this view, he will take into account Peirce's categoriology, taken as a diagram of the synthetic intelligenic process. Following these ascending stairs of firstness, secondness, and thirdness, taking into account all the gray areas Peirce has placed in between these categories, and quickly doubling in Peirce's encounters with the Schelling's philosophy of nature, he will therefore describe an intelligence which is non-human, born out of accidents, coincidences, and chances, and which upholds chaos without negating rationality and the legacy of rationalism. Ben Woodard is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Philosophy and Art Theory in Lüneburg, Germany. Ben's talk will be directed to the status of the non-logical but formal in Naturphilosophie and Romantic science, too often neglected or erased by generalized appeals of the organic. He focuses on the developments of early biology in Germany, so to understand life in various formal means, whether through morphology, models of self-organization, or a combination of mechanism and theology. Ben notes that Gilles Châtelet, Ian Grant, and others have pointed out such thought is collectively interested in a proto-topology which attempts to find expressible invariances of the continuity of thought and nature. Such research, he argues, is important beyond its historical value as to pass through the deadlock of anti-embodiment cognitivism and anti-representational cognitive models, rather than attempting to locate thought out in the world, or primarily in the head. According to Ben, the special forms defined thinkers such as Schelling attempt to view thought as a type of motion with embodied constraints complicated by virtual capacities. Anna Longo teaches at the University of Paris, the Pantheon Sorbonne. Anna will introduce her intervention by mentioning a conversation occurred in 1953 between Gotthard Günther and Kurt Gödel. This discussion concerned Hegel's logic and the possibility of building a machine capable of reflection, that is, of taking its own concepts as an object of thought. Anna's paper will thus show that the importance of Hegel logic for the developments of Gödel's notion of recursivity, which will be used to create the first computers. She will also raise some question about the political implication of such a move, in particular, the exclusion of the Marxist interpretation of Hegel's dialectic, which leads to a transformation of the social structure. Finally, Daniel Sassilotto is currently finishing his Daniel Sassilotto will intervene. He's currently finishing his monograph, chiefly inspired by the works of Wilfrid Sellars. In his talk, Daniel provides a schematic outline for a formal theory of the subject by way of a functionalist pragmatic cognitive hierarchy of sapient intelligence, largely supplementing and revising Robert's random semantic hierarchy account in how has analytical philosophy failed cognitive science. Drawing insights from the works of Susan Carey, Lawrence Puntel, Michael Tomasello, and Peter Wolfendale, this framework, elaborated by Daniel, crucially sees in the development of conceptual inferential behavior an escalating process by virtue which sapient system not only engage in patterns of material and formal reasoning that allow it to represent the structure of the world in ever more sophisticated way, but to do so by engaging in patterns of theoretical revision and systematic integration through techniques of mathematical formalization. On this basis, Daniel explains the way in which sapient cognition integrate and circumscribe perceptual, inferential, and practical abilities, and specify the development of mind from barren discriminatory capacity shared with inanimate objects, all the way to complex theory forming, systematizing conceptual abilities which enable agents to theoretically represent and intervene upon the world of which they are part. I'll now hand over to Enrico.
So, hi everyone, and thank you so much, Andrea, for the great introduction. So my talk is actually going to be a little bit of a critique of Reza Negarestani's Inhumanism. So first things first, let's start with a little, let's say, definition of what I believe is the best way to conceptualize Inhumanism. Inhumanism is born out of what we could call a sort of continuum which unites all of the various philosophies born out of speculative realism. So Inhumanism, in a sense, is an offshoot of this wider movement we could call speculative realism, born out of Quentin Meillassoux philosophy and which expanded very much. But what is the peculiarity of inhumanism? Well, inhumanism is, in a sense, a sort of a recapitulation of the transcendental school of thought. And in a sense, it's like a sort of taking back the task of speculative and transcendental philosophy of philosophers like Kant and Hegel, and sort of update it to an inhuman plateau. Quoting Negarestani, we can say that inhumanism is the inquisitive renegotiation of human faculties, their limits and vulnerabilities. In a sense, it's sort of what Kant was saying when he was talking about transcendental philosophy. Basically, it's a sort of understanding of human cognition and an analysis of human cognition made extremely systematic and sort of transcendental. So, in a sense, we could still quote Negarestani saying that inhumanism is systematically regional. It is an analysis of a very specific subject, which is the human subject, in transcendental terms. It is an outside view of ourselves, which points towards a redefinition of what the human is and what an intelligent human is. But what is the human in this proposal? In a sense, we could say that this is sort of what humanism has always been about, a definition of what the human is. The inhuman starts when we sort of de-essentialize intelligence and when we do this sort of shift that Negarestani makes in the labor of the inhuman. Intelligence, which is the characteristic of the sapient agent, is not something that it's in our brain or that it's within the human subject, but it's de-essentialized. It's a space of reason. Quoting Negarestani, it's a communal saying and doing happening outside ourselves in a community of agents, giving and taking reasons to be, do, think, such and such. In a sense, the inhuman is simply the fact that this reason, which happens outside our brain in its sort of a communal way, overcomes and reach forward outside of the needs of our species. In a sense, it's inhuman because it's what a sort of striving to be more human than human, we could say. It is, in a way, a way to redescribe the human agent without sort of positing a sort of human nature. It is inhuman because it's outside ourselves, even though we are in it. It's a space we inhabit. So we could say, quoting Mark Fisher, that in this sense, it is the best interest of the human species. It's to coincide with becoming inhuman. In a way, it's just the unfolding of this space we are inhabiting and in which we are sort of hosts. So, still quoting Negarestani, inhumanism is a labor that consists of extending the elaboration of what it means to be human through a series of upgradable spatial performances. And that is rigorously inhuman. So now we have a sort of general definition of what inhumanism is. It is a sort of rationalism taken outside of ourselves. It is a very sober, transcendental philosophy which sort of takes back the good things, we could say, that Kant and Hegel sort of put forth. So what's the deal? What's the problem? Well, my problem starts in a very specific point of the labor of the inhuman, where Negarestani says that the distinction between sapience and sentience is marked by a functional demarcation rather than a structural one. Therefore, it is fully open to historification and open to naturalization. And my critique, putting it bluntly, is it? Is it open to naturalization put in these terms? Because Negarestani, in this sort of, in the paper, but also in Intelligence and Spirit, which is a full-blown elaboration of this philosophy, always talks about this intelligenic process in strictly dualistic terms. We have the sentient beings, which are outside of the space of reasons, for many reasons, jokingly. And on the other hand, we have the sapient agents, which are not human, or they're not necessarily human, but nonetheless are agents which sort of participate in this wider space. So we have this clear-cut division between the sentient and the sapient. We have a sort of nature that is split apart at the middle, and it's divided in various, in very neat categories. I do believe that this sort of division halts the possibility of naturalization in a dramatic and almost irreconcilable way. Once we divide nature into strictly dualistic terms, we cannot fully see the evolutionary continuum which unites the various organic forms of life and even the inorganic going all the way back. So there's sort of a nature phobia in this division of the sapient and the sentient. Of course, following this critique, we kind of have a bifurcation. We could go two ways. We could go towards the ineffable, the embodied and ecological sort of route, saying that everything is one with the world and there is no real distinction between the various agents which participate or do not participate in the spaces of reason. So there's like a sort of flatness which unites everyone under the same umbrella, or we can go the sort of what I would like to call the rationalist way. We could take this sort of dualistic division and put it away and propose another rationalist model to actually create a sort of toy model of intelligence. We could use a different set of categories to describe intelligence in a fully inhuman way. In other words, we can still hold on to the general project of inhumanism without throwing away the baby with the bathtub, with the bathwater, but we can also sort of upgrade it. We can make it better through a deployment of different categories. We can, in other words, out-rationalize Negarestani in a sense. And to do so, I actually hold on to an author which is very much within Negarestani's milieu. It's not some external influence coming from without inhumanism and these forms of neo-rationalism, but it's an agent which worked within inhumanism very much. And it's the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce. The reason, aside from the sort of philological proximity between Negarestani and Peirce, it's also because, in my opinion, Peirce is very much a thinker of the spaces of reasons, of the space of reasons. It's a thinker of, it's an inhumanist before the inhumanism was even a thing. So much so that in the collected papers, which are very messy, and they're sort of mishmash of different materials, Peirce sort of foreshadows this sort of communal construction of reason in a very clear-cut and beautiful example, saying that just as we say that a body is in motion and not that motion is in a body, we ought to say that we are in thought and not that thoughts are in us. In a sense, we have this sort of foreshadowing of what inhumanism would become. For Peirce, intelligence is semiosis, and semiosis, the production of symbols and categories, comes from the outside. It's not something that comes from within. At the same time, I believe Peirce has a very, very different way of describing the sort of intelligenic process and the division of sentience and sapience, and it's probably a better way to describe the sort of process. In a very Schellingian way, and I'm going to quote Schelling here because I think there's a clear connection between the two. Peirce tries to diagram the laws of the mind and sort of create an image of the mind, which is very much naturalistic. It's sort of within this milieu of philosophy of nature. In fact, Schelling in the Universal Deduction of the dynamic process says that originally and necessarily nature not only expresses but even realizes the laws of the mind. And Peirce goes as one step forward and writes an article called "The Laws of Mind." In a sense, there's this sort of continuation between the two types of philosophy. there's a sort of completion of nature philosophy in Peirce. But let's sort of describe this model to kind of wrap up my whole talk. So for Peirce, there's to describe the intelligenic process, we have to understand, on one hand, a sort of physical tendency of thought, and on the other, we have to understand a diagram of categories which charts this movement. Peirce says in the laws of mind that ideas tend to go from the more particular to the more abstract in a sort of continuous growth that goes from simple sort of sensations to abstraction without breaks. So we have not so much a sort of a priori scheme, but we have a synthetic production of intelligence. And this is the first thing which I oppose to Negarestani. There's not a sort of clear-cut division, but there's first and foremost the study of the genesis of intelligence as a transcendental a priori to study intelligence. On the other hand, and sort of to counter the nature phobia I said that Negarestani has in humanism, Peirce affirms that all regularities of nature and of mind are regarded as products of growth, and to a Schelling fashion idealism which holds matter as a mere specialized and partially deadened mind. So there's this sort of continuous that goes from the inorganic to the sapient. There's no breaks in there. There's sort of a structuration, a synthetic structuration of intelligence. This, of course, is deeply Schellingian and sort of halts the humanist project and forces it to consider nature first and foremost. Secondly, we have the categories. This is not some sort of flatness where everything is the same, but Peirce proposed 3 categories to describe the intelligenic process. You go from firstness to secondness to thirdness. Firstness is mere virtual data. It's sort of the ground, or probably better, the unground for the production of intelligence. Then there's secondness, which is sort of mechanical structuration. It's the binding of stuff together, physical laws and whatever. And then there's the emergence from this sort of physical structuration of matter, of intelligence through thirdness, to the production of symbols. So there's this sort of charted, a diagram of growth of intelligence within nature itself that goes from the inorganic to the organic without breaks and evolves through different structurations of matter itself. So sort of lastly, to wrap it up, I think that the last thing we could take away from Peirce is this diagram is not finite. It's not the be-all, end-all to the study of intelligence. We do not have a sort of finite model or a super toy that sort of encompasses all intelligence at once. We have an open experimentalism. Peirce has tried to chart many different categories throughout his life, and the 3 categories are just a sort of step, and the most complete step we have in this sort of big, wild experimentalism that he was putting on. So at last, there is this sort of experimental reason which must unwrite itself in order to chart its own evolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrico. Now I'll hand over the mic to Ben. Ben, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly. Hold on a second. Try to speak again.
Hello?
Oh, wait.
I can hear Ben perfectly.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, so I guess I'll start then. So, I mean, usually in these kinds of conversations that talk about inhumanism and rationalism and nature, often anything that makes any appeal to nature or to the organic is seen, of course, as usually embodying this kind of embodied perspective or this organicist perspective, which is seen to assume that we have immediate knowledge of our surroundings and that, that nature somehow is panpsychic or that intelligence kind of just happens easily. And none of these things are ideas that Schelling shared. He thought that intelligence arose from nature and that it arose as a sort of problem for nature. And of course, the thinking or intelligence is a problem for us because we're thinking things, right? We can't look at thought outside of it and understand, what the limits of human thought are. And even though when Schelling has these really idealist moments, he's still pretty careful to point out that, the fact that when he says things like nature should realize the laws of the mind, he of course says things like, we are not pure spirits, we are not just intelligence. We have bodies, we're located in a particular space and time, and we have particular physical capacities. And our intelligence has to be seen as conditioned by all of these things. But of course, at the same time, we don't know whether they count as limits in any stringent sense. So one of the ways this can be fleshed out, and of course, part of the issue is that Schelling is seen as a thinker who doesn't have a logic and doesn't have a sort of formal apparatus that Hegel has, for instance. And it's also often assumed that the Romantics and the Naturphilosophen, like Novalis and Ritter and many other figures like Goethe, that on the one hand, they were either philosophers or they were sort of, poets, and that they were either systematic or they were completely non-systematic. And this, this kind of confuses and makes differences between them which shouldn't really exist. And another part of this is also the fact that they're seen as being anti-formal in some sense, as not having any interest in logic or mathematics. And, that's very much not the case. And, one of the thinkers who has shown this most clearly is, of course, Gilles Châtelet, who attempts to see and find the kind of the logic of the diagram in Schelling's thoughts in particular. And even though Châtelet has done this, Châtelet himself is then often accused of being a merely organicist thinker, of being a thinker who just celebrates life or the living at the cost of the formal or of the rational. And if you've read Châtelet and to know Châtelet's background in mathematics and physics, as well as philosophy, that should strike anyone as absurd. It's just that the mathematics and physics and the way he wanted to talk about thinking in relationship to the formal was not one of an easily readable, it wasn't one of a kind of computational logic. It was one of this diagrammatic logic. And there's a kind of striking page in the end of the introduction to his main work, Figure in Space, Les Enjeux de Mobile in French, where he cites this passage from Schelling, where Châtelet says, our biggest enemy is those who see the world as just something to be pillaged for information and not without understanding how the very process of learning itself depends upon the sort of richness of the world. And Châtelet quotes this passage from a very strange book of Schelling's, which is called Clara, which is a novel, an unfinished novel, in which a doctor, a priest, and Clara are discussing life after death, among other things. And they, at one point, the doctor and Clara think that life in nature or nature itself must somehow have sadness in it. This idea that, the fact that she feels sad or feels an emotion because of the color of an object, this is something that she says must be in the object in some sense. And Châtelet quotes this and says that, mind, this is one indication that mind is not only in the head, right? Mind is out in the world. Now, this has been taken as a sort of, as Châtelet endorsing a kind of externalism, in the sense that, thinking occurs mostly or primarily outside of the head, and that we just sort of respond to it in some sense. And Elaine Berthoz, in this book called The Brain Sense of Movement, actually quotes Chatelet's quote of Schelling and says that Berthoz says, as a neuroscientist, we have to combat this romantic idea that Chatelet has, this idea that thinking could be in the brain, or that the brain is highly complex. This shouldn't scare people like Chatelet. This shouldn't scare scientists and philosophers. They just need to understand how complex the brain is, and they'll stop making these kinds of romantic statements. And it's kind of a strange misrecognition, because Berthoz thinks that Chatelet is being kind of anti-formal, or that he's being sort of anti-neuroscience, which isn't really the point. That Chatelet's point is almost a political one about how science is done. He's critical of science as a capitalistic enterprise, and that has reductionism, in the sense of reductionism being use value of knowledge, not that it explains things through formalism. So there's two types of reduction being confused by Berthoz, who then in his book talks about perception and our thinking about perception as a simulation of knowledge, as a simulation of action, which is something that's actually very Schellinian, and which Berthoz actually connects to Merleau-Ponty. And this is actually something that Merleau-Ponty sees in Schelling's work. So you have a really strange misrecognition, sort of missed opportunity between this kind of expanded cognitivist model of someone like Elaine Berthoz, and this expanded organicist or naturalist model of somebody like Chatelet following Schelling. And part of the point is that part of this misrecognition relies on the fact that, again, these organicists, or the idea that organicism, or that the work of naturphilosophy, is often seen as having this naive naturalism, as this kind of holistic, continuous naturalism that resists any type of explanation. Whereas, again, both Chatelet and Schelling say that no, it's not that it resists explanation, but that, since everything is contained in nature, every form of explanation has a formal and a naturalistic element, which are, again, they're conditions and grounds of other explanations, but they never end, right? The sort of learning of learning must always go on, as Chatelet puts it. And where Schelling expands this most extensively is in his later Berlin lectures. He talks about thinking as a form of motion, right? And so he says, the way that different species understand motion, of course, determines things that we would see as very formal. He uses the simple example of, we have a formal definition of frontward and backward, but of course the embodied version of something like forward and backward is very different for a bird than it is for a bipedal organism. And he uses this kind of simple example of, like, there's a constructive constraint in the fact that not that you can't have certain concepts because of your embodiment, but your embodiment is going to orientate certain concepts in a structure that is not directly accessible, but has to be found in this more oblique sense. And this is why the diagram of the gesture is one way of doing this, Chatelet argues. And so one of the ways that this comes out in Schelling's work, and it's actually talked about in the universal deduction, which was mentioned in the last talk, that the diagrammatically understanding processes in nature doesn't mean that we have explained them formally, in the sense that we have reduced them only to a formalism, of course, but that when you diagram certain processes in nature, you understand those formalisms or those diagrams as themselves being just as natural as they are formal. One of the ways that Schelling explains this is he says the notion of a field, the notion of a distribution of energy is how we understand something is how we understand the electrical, right? Or the chemical for us is what we understand in terms of a body, right? And he also attaches this to dimensionality in the sense that the electrical, this is this dimension, this two-way split, this bifurcation of charge, whereas the body is this three-dimensional growth of the tensor field, right? So when the Romantics, when somebody like C.S. Weiss or somebody like Schelling says that a crystal is an exhibition of algebra and topology, they're not sort of being naively romantic in this sense that's often said, as if, the crystal is realizing the algebra in our heads, right? But that, the formalism of algebra diagrammatically expressed is a crystal. So this neither says that formalism is manifested necessarily, nor is embodiment necessarily add anything to the proof of the structure of mathematics. It's simply that certain conditions of certain types of formal expression can only be seen in relationship to their location in nature. So the fact that, the crystal embodies algebra and algebraic topology tells us something about the rules, tells us something about the uses of algebraic topology in terms of resonance and concepts of transmission and things like this. So, this assumption that nature philosophy was this naive poetry of nature is not only bad history, because it overlooks all the experimental work that Schelling himself did along with Ritter and Goethe and many others. But it assumes that any indirect means of exhibition of the formal is necessarily an aesthetic endeavor and not a mathematical or rational one, or we could say not a cognitive one. And I think this relationship between exhibition of the formal and seeing the formal as not this kind of reduction for tool use is something that's sadly missing in a lot of discussions about cognitive science and these kinds of oppositions between the rational computational models of mind and these embodied, enacted, extended, so on and so forth models. It's often seen that if you have representation, right, as the cognitive models emphasize, then thinking is really in the head, right? Thinking really takes place and starts in the head in a real sense. Whereas, of course, a lot of the embodied mind people, whether it's Clark or Alvanoe or Damasio or the various flavors of it, of course, want to say that, no, there's something in the body or in the environment, right? There's some notion of feedback at various scales, which really leads to the genesis of thinking, right? And they see it as this, often this kind of phenomenological project of, of de-emphasizing rationality as a kind of individual endeavor. But neither one really sees how a representation could function as a collective social endeavor of thinking, just as much as it would be a naturalistic endeavor. The fact that we can exhibit formalisms by creating them means, yes, thought is outside the head, but the act of thinking in a particular formal way is what allows thought in the head to be expressed and collectively articulated in a kind of meaningful sense. So again, this picture of Schelling and his followers, that they are just writing bad poetry about nature and calling it philosophy, is really a sad result of positivist history of science. And on the other side, trying to champion the Romantics and the Naturphilosophen as the enemies of reason and the enemies of formalism. And of course, both sides paint this sort of false caricature of the other in order to make science and philosophy the enemies they're supposed to be now in the 21st century. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was great. I'll hand over the mic to Anna Longo. Anna, can you hear me?
Hi, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. Hi. So I find my paper, okay. So I'm going to start with a quotation from a letter that Kurt Gödel wrote as an answer to Gotthard Gunther. So who is Gotthard Gunther? So Gotthard Gunther was a German philosopher who was trying to produce a logic based on levels of reflection, but was inspired by Hegel's logic. And in particular, Gunther was interested in revising formal logic to accommodate idealist insight into the nature of thought. Moreover, Gunther wished to create a thinking machine whose model was actually Hegel's idealist reflection. So that's the reason why Gunther and Kurt Gödel exchanged letters between 1952 and 1961. So I'm quoting from a letter that Gödel wrote as an answer to Gunther. So Gödel said, I quote, "The reflection on the subject treated in idealistic philosophy, the distinction of levels of reflection, seems to me interesting and correct. I even consider it entirely possible that this is the way to correct metaphysics." End of quote. So in this talk, I'm going to show why Gödel thinks that idealist, and in particular Hegel's reflection, has to be taken into account in order to provide a metaphysical foundation of knowledge, and why he thinks that it must be corrected. This will allow me to explain which is the difference, according to Gödel, between a Turing machine and a human spirit. So the problem here concerns the foundation of mathematics. So from the perspective of absolute knowledge, from this perspective, the absolute knowledge would be the achievement of Hilbert's program of axiomatization. So as you know, Hilbert thought formal systems which are demonstrably consistent and complete. So any mathematical problem should, for Hilbert, have a solution, an answer, yes or no. In particular, the formal system of arithmetics should be complete. That means that each of its assertions, as long as it's well formulated, should be decidable. So according to Hilbert, arithmetic would then have been removed from the intuition of counting and ordering in time and space, that was for Kant, and thanks to finite computation, it would have elevated itself by pulling on itself, just in the same way as the Baron of Munchausen would lift himself up by pulling on his own hair. So we can compare this conception of demonstrably consistent and complete axiomatic to Hegel's notion of absolute knowledge, which is the knowledge of the immanent rules by which reason constructs any reality. However, as you know, after the publication of Kurt Gödel's incomplete theorems in 1931, Hilbert's dream of achieving a consistent and complete axiomatic turned out to be impossible, as well as Hegel's aim of getting absolute and totalizing knowledge. So the two Gödel's theorems prove that if arithmetics, here formal number theory, is consistent, that means it does not prove a contradiction, then not only it is incomplete, meaning that there exists in its language assertions which are undecidable, but that it is also impossible to complete. So it has no consistent and complete formal extension. So arithmetics is non-completable. This means that it is impossible to add signs or formal axioms to define a complete or maximal theory which contains arithmetics. But there is more. The consistency of arithmetics, when it is formalized in the manner of Hilbert, cannot be demonstrated within arithmetics. In other words, there is no finitary proof of consistency for arithmetics. However, Gödel showed that it's possible to lengthen finite induction along infinite ordinals in order to improve the situation and, in a technically interesting way, to set a hierarchy between theories and to shift the problem of consistency from theory to theory. It nevertheless remains that non-completability is provable and it is intrinsic to the system. So, if such and such axioms are assumed, then such and such a theorem holds. That must necessarily be true in an absolute sense. To get this absolute certainty, one has to prove that the axioms are not arbitrary, but must be correct mathematical propositions, and moreover, evident without proof. So from this standpoint, all of mathematics is reducible to abstract set theory. For example, a theory of a number theory can be interpreted to be an assertion about finite sets. So the problem at stake is the axiomatization of set theory. Instead of ending up with a finite number of axioms, as in geometry, one is faced here with an infinite series of axioms, which can be extended further and further without any ending being visible, and apparently without any possibility of comprising all these axioms in a finite rule producing them. If, for example, we begin with the integers, that is the finite sets of special kind of numbers, we have at first the set of the integers and the axioms referring to them, which is the first level, then the set of the sets of integers with their axioms, which are the axioms of the second level, and so on for any finite iteration of the operation set of. Next, we have a set of all these sets of finite order. But now we can deal with this set in exactly the same manner as we dealt with the set of integers before, that is, consider the subset of it and formulate axioms about their existence. Evidently, this procedure can be iterated up to any transfinite ordinal number. However, this is not the end, nor can there ever be an end to this procedure of forming axioms, because the very formulation of the axioms up to a certain stage give rise to the next axiom. To be more exact, each of these set theoretical axioms entails the solution of a certain problem which had been undecidable on the basis of the preceding axioms. So the historical importance of Gödel's article not only regards the foundation of mathematics, but also the technique invented through the first theorem proof. So this technique is the Gödelization and the definition of the class of recursive functions, which will pave the way for the theory of computability and thence for the works of Turing during the 30s. So Gödel's procedure consists in a sort of mechanization of mathematics, such that it should be possible to build a finite machine in a precise sense of a Turing machine, which will write down all the consequences of the axioms one after the other. So for this reason, the first theorem is equivalent to the fact that there exists no finite procedure for the systematic decision of all defined time problems. Moreover, the second theorem claims that, although one can get finite procedures specifying the truth value of finite sets, there is no procedure that allows us to produce the totality of the axioms of mathematics. However, Gödel provided the way to compute and mechanically produce true statements concerning finite sets. But this entails also a major philosophical problem, that we cannot find any finite procedure to produce all the mathematical truths. Does it mean that no well-defined system of correct axioms can contain all of mathematics proper? Evidently, no well-defined system of correct axioms can comprise all of objective mathematics, since the proposition which states the consistency of a system is true, but not demonstrable in the system. Anyway, it is not precluded that there should exist a finite rule producing all its evident axioms. However, as Gödel argues, if such a rule exists, we, with our human understanding, will certainly never know it to be such. That is, we could never know with a mathematical certainty that all the propositions it produces are correct. We could perceive to be true only one proposition after the other for a finite number of them in an empirical way. According to Gödel, this would mean that the human mind in the realm of pure mathematics is equivalent to a finite machine that, however, is unable to understand completely its own functioning. This inability of man to understand himself would then wrongly appear to him as the mind's boundlessness and inexhaustibility. For if the human minds were equivalent to a finite machine, then objective mathematics not only would be uncompletable in the sense of not being contained in any well-defined axiomatic system, but moreover, there would exist absolutely unsolvable Diophantine problems. So, as Gödel states, the following disjunctive conclusion is inevitable. I quote, either mathematics is uncompletable in this sense, that is evident, its evident axioms can never be comprised in a finite rule, that is to say, the human mind, even within the realm of pure mathematics, infinitely surpasses the power of any finite machine, or else there exists absolutely unsolvable Diophantine problems of the type specified. End of quote. So according to Gödel, the first is true, so that the human mind surpasses any Turing machine. And he claims that, I quote, my theorems only show that the mechanization of mathematics is impossible if one wants to have a satisfactory foundation and system of mathematics. But I have not proved that there are mathematical questions undecidable for the human mind, but only that there is no machine or blind formalism that can decide all number theoretical questions. So from a philosophical standpoint, Gödel claims that the human mind surpasses the power of any machine, not because it can think of all the mathematical truths as deriving from some axioms, but because it has the power of dealing with concepts and ideas. So according to Gödel, extensional paradoxes can be treated mechanically by recursive functions, but intensive paradoxes cannot. And intensive paradoxes are paradoxes concerning concepts. For example, in set theory, the extensional paradox of a set of all the sets which do not belong to themselves can be solved considering different levels: the axiomatic of the elements of a set and the axiomatic of the parts of the set. However, this cannot be done for intentional paradoxes, since a concept can be referred to itself, like, for example, difficult is a difficult concept or vague is a vague concept. And this entails that concepts are not classes or sets. Thus, according to Gödel, we don't have an appropriate theory of concepts, although we have an axiomatic theory of some extensional domain of the concept, such as sets. As Gödel said to Hao Wang, I quote, set is a formal concept. If we replace the concept of set by the concept of concept, we get logic. The concept of concept is certainly formal and therefore a logical concept, but no intuition of this concept, in contrast to that of set, has been developed. End of quote. So even though what is not computable for a Turing machine is not computable also for humans, Gödel is convinced that the human mind cannot be reduced to a Turing machine, because it is potentially capable of a logic of the concept, which means that it is able to grasp concepts and ideas as pure abstract truths. Our finite axiomatics are but partial and objective extension of concepts which are richer than the mathematics that we are able to produce. As Gödel said to Hao Wang, I quote, if you introduce the concept of concept, the result is still logic, but going higher. The concept of concept would be too abstract and no longer logic. End of quote. And Gödel continues. The general concept of concept is an idea in the Kantian sense. The intentional paradoxes are related to the questions about ideas. Ideas are more fundamental than concepts. The theory of types is only natural between the first and the second level. It is not natural at higher levels. Laying the foundation deep cannot be extensive. End of quote. Thus, the mind has the possibility of having a glimpse of the world of the true mathematical objects, and this in a Platonic sense. Gödel was Platonic in this. It was realist about the existence of the idea and mathematical objects, although absolute knowledge will never be possible. The inexhaustibility of mathematics depends on the inexhaustibility of abstract ideas or concepts of concepts. As Gödel said, I quote, concepts are there but not in a definite place. They are related each in the other in a conceptual space. Concepts are not the moving force of the world, like Hegel claimed, but may act on the mind in some way. We have means of knowing something about the spiritual world. The meaning of the world would be part of what is given outside of sensations. Hegelian synthesis is concerned also with higher levels and higher forms of wish, which are directly given outside of sensations. End of quote. Accordingly, Gödel thinks that Hegel was on the right way, even though his logic must be corrected. As Gödel said, I quote, in other words, there might be another way of analyzing concepts with respect to the Hegelian, so that true analysis will lead to the solution of a problem. At present, we possess only subjective analysis of the concepts. End of quote. So the logic that Gödel is looking for is then a logic of the concept, even though he is aware that this logic of the concept could never be achieved by our finite minds. He thinks that we have to consider absolute knowledge of this kind as an idea in the Kantian sense, as a regulative idea. Moreover, he is convinced that the achievement of absolute knowledge will necessarily entail, as Hegel stated, that reason has to understand itself. Accordingly, Turing machines are embodying our partial knowledge of what reason is, in the same way as set theory is the objectification of a partial glimpse of the concept of set. So we are machines who do not properly understand how they do work. Our reason do not properly understand its own working, but this does not exclude that such a clarification can be possible by pursuing a correct logic of the concept. Anyway, Gödel do not understand this self-comprehension of reason as an identity of reason and being, but as the understanding of an infinite generative power that would justify the inexhaustibility of mathematics. As Gödel claims, I quote, no, I don't think I would get on with Hegel. Hegel seems to me to be always wanting to say that things which look different are really the same, whereas my interest is in showing that things which look the same are really different. End of quote. So Gödel did not go further on this point, but he would suggest that what he had in mind was a correction of Hegel's dialectic in order to avoid to consider absolute knowledge as a totalization in favor of knowledge of the ever-ending productivity of the ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Now it's Daniel's turn. Daniel, are you there?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hello. So I've prepared something to show for you guys. So
Hello. Wait a second.
sure. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. Tell me when I'm good to go.
Andrea, it's good.
Okay, great. So hello everybody. I prepared a little something. So I have. Hopefully, I can get through everything very quickly. So, you're seeing the slideshow, right? Just a very quick yes.
Perfectly, yes.
Excellent. So, a lot of what I will say is continuous to what we've been hearing already. It concerns sort of retrospective gaze on the contemporary appropriation of the German idealist legacy within the contemporary philosophical context, and also of the legacy of naturalism in this rekindling of German idealism. So, as we've already heard, we are witnessing, in fact, a kind of new rekindling of the German idealist tradition and also of the rationalist tradition in the contemporary philosophical context, but in a kind of a new way, informed by new waves of research in formal and natural sciences, after the ontological turn of the 20th century and the violent critique of metaphysics that threatened the possibility of philosophy during this so-called postmodern sequence. And really, thinkers as vast and diverse as Alain Badiou, Fernando Salamea, Robert Brandom, Ray Brassier, Reza Negarestani, Daniel Macbeth, Peter Wolfendale, all of them have proposed new possibilities for thinking of, hello? Is this, okay. Basically rekindling the classical aims of philosophy, both the ontological and epistemological aims of philosophy, and away from the relativistic consequences of the last century that the postmodern saga was supposed to lead us to. And really, there are two or three basic ideas from German idealism that I believe have acquired new vigor in the contemporary context. First, from Kant, there's the idea of providing a robust theory of experience in terms of a series of faculties, right, through which our perceptual, conceptual, and agential or behavioral capacities are accounted for in their distinctness, but also in their integration as part of a singular consciousness, right? So this is what Kant called the transcendental unity of apperception, which is composed of several constitutive faculties, but which jointly compose what we call cognition or experience, right? Second, there's this Hegelian idea of understanding the sapient mind, not just psychologically as an individual consciousness, but essentially as a social and historical collective being, which does not only represent the world so as to know it, but which in doing so transforms it, the world, and itself progressively. And finally, the third point I isolate here is the prospects for a systematic philosophy, in which one does not only attempt to think of the relationship between, say, science and philosophy narrowly, but also the distinctiveness of different kinds of thought and practice as part of an integral theoretical framework. So the aesthetic, the political, the historical, and so on. And perhaps one should add here a fourth point, which is the preoccupation that German idealism, of course, had in the wake of Naturphilosophie with reinventing and rearticulating our accounts of nature, although this was pursued in rather different ways across its different iterations. Now, with that said, departing from these points, there's at least three ways in which the new attempts to rekindle the German idealist program depart from its classical iterations. So first, we see that today the new thinkers are generally trying to escape the skeptical and idealist conclusions that Kant and Hegel arrived at in the name of a materialist or realist perspective that defends the autonomy of the mind-independent world in ontological terms, but also the possibility of knowledge. answering what we call today the emergence and demarcation questions. The emergence question being, how does mind emerge from nature? How is it that the sapient mind emerges from sentient sentient consciousness, and this in turn from inanimate matter? But also how to demarcate clearly, not just genealogically in natural history, but the functional architecture of these different modalities of experience or natural formation. So that's the first one. Secondly, it refuses the hostility to formalization, which, for instance, Hegel evinced with regard to formal logic. And it attempts to think of the way in which formalization is actually constitutive of our ontological and epistemological self-consciousness. Now, of course, as we heard from Ben, it would be wrong to presume that German idealism in its classical iteration was always hostile to formalization. But certainly, at least Hegel, thought that the resources of formal logic were in some way limited to what properly speculative logic could provide. And finally, it subtracts the ideal of systematicity from foundationalist epistemological assumptions that guided the great systems of philosophy, in view of more dynamic, coherentist, and a historical perspective that accounts for how thinking develops as part of our natural and cultural history. Those of you who are familiar, I'm sure Ben is, with Heidegger's, for example, book on Schelling, on the concept of human freedom. He makes a big fuss about how it is that the concept of the system really emerges in the modern period, and it becomes, particularly native to the German idealist sequence. And one of the things that Heidegger associates with the birth of systematicity, or the concept of the system in modern philosophy, is precisely a kind of epistemological foundationalism, which he associates with the birth of modern science and the mathematization of nature. So in the contemporary context, what we're seeing is an attempt to try to move or subtract the ideal of systematicity away from this kind of parochial foundationalist dream that might have guided the modern saga. Now, more importantly, perhaps, the contemporary accounts or attempts to rekindle Kant and Hegel has been attempted by way of what is called a functionalist computationalist account of cognition in its psychological and socio-historical dimensions. And this essentially means two things, like boiled down to its essentials. So functionalism entails that one understands the things in terms of the role that that thing plays in a system of relations, rather than by any internal properties pertaining to its material basis. So, the example that I always like to give is, try to think of how would you define a pawn in the context of a game of chess. You wouldn't naturally describe it in terms of what constitutes a particular given pawn, but you would rather more naturally explain the role that it plays in the context of the rules and the other pieces that jointly compose the game of chess. And this is, of course, still already very, very close to the Kantian conception of the understanding as the faculty of associating representations in a functional manner. So functionalism was already, in a certain way, native to the classical German idealist sequence. Computationalism, on the other hand, understands the function constitutive of sapient mind in relationship to its material basis, in analogy to how we understand the relationship between the software and hardware of a computer. And this computationalist paradigm has become attractive today in the wake of new approaches to artificial intelligence, AGI, interactivist, approaches, et cetera, and novel ways to understand the notion of what is called an effective procedure or algorithmic process. So functionalist computationalism, or functionalist computationalist theories of the subject, attempt to think the mind as a series of integrated functional capacities which jointly instantiate the robust discursive socio-historical intelligence that we associate with cognition. And as we have heard already from Enrico, this is actually something that is, very much native to the work, for example, of Negarestani, but already finds itself in the early configuration of the birth of cognitive science in the 1960s, in the work of Hilary Putnam, and in the philosophical work of Wilfrid Sellars. Now, what I want to do very briefly today is just show a little bit of ongoing research. Now, in this essay called "How Has Analytic Philosophy Failed Cognitive Science?" Sorry, there's a word missing, so I mistyped the title. The philosopher Robert Brandom has proposed what he calls a semantic hierarchy, which attempts to explain really a series of thresholds, a series of cognitive thresholds, which trace the evolution of the mind, of sapient intelligence, from our preconceptual capacities to discriminate between stimuli to more robust conceptual behavior. And this is introduced as an attempt to supplement what is called the syntactic hierarchy, which was famously elaborated by Noam Chomsky. And here's the Brandonian hierarchy. I will not get into this right now because I think my own account of this will flesh it out in its own way. But my central contention is, in short, that we can expand Brandon's hierarchy to more robustly account for the different kinds of capacities that compose the sapient mind. And basically, my own approach is to try to integrate this Brandonian project or attempt by way of other collateral methods, among which I signal out Lawrence Pintel's project for what he calls a global systematics and his account of formal theorization, Peter Wolfendale's genealogy of what he names information processing systems, James Ladyman and Don Ross's structural realist account of localization, and Jay Rosenberg's convergent realist account of theory succession. Now, I can't obviously explain all of this at once, but in short notice, I will give you some more information about this. And in any case, this is part of a larger project, a book project that I am almost done with, in which I try to reconcile the prospects of a functionalist computationalist theory of the subject with a realist theory of knowledge and a naturalist ontology. So I think the one thing that we all share in this panel is sort of a resistance to the hostility that some of the vectors in quote-unquote neo-rationalist philosophy, whatever you want to call it, appear to hold against naturalism in the name of a transcendental approach or whatever else, right? And the essential result that I want to present to you very briefly is the 7-step cognitive hierarchy, which traces the functional scaffolding of the sapient mind from bare differential responsiveness to classify inputs from the environment all the way up to high-level theoretical capacities to formalize and systematize domains of inquiry through theoretical means, and which finally can also be assessed in terms of how correctly or adequately they can be said to represent a mind-independent world. So, this is precisely the scaffolding of functionalism with realism that I want to pull through. So without further ado, here's a diagram that basically summarizes the 7 steps. It's actually from the top to the bottom. And I mean, what I will do now is very, very quickly just try to run down through the 7 steps, just giving a brief indication. Obviously, I can't get into terrible detail here, but this will have to do. So beginning, the most basic sort of level of cognitive ability at the base of the cognitive hierarchy, or the height of the cognitive hierarchy, a system is capable of differentially responding to its environment and to classify items within it. And this forms the basis really of what we call representational competence, or what the philosopher Wilfrid Sellars calls map making. Now, in its computationalist, functionalist sort of most developed iteration, drawing from the philosophers of science James Ladyman and Don Ross, we can characterize the way that a system navigates its environment in a directed manner by responding to specific phenomena, by mentioning what is called their locators. And what locators are essentially is a set of functions or instructions for measurement, which basically work to orient a system and its measurement apparatus to gather data and to take measurements across it. So more technically, the definition that I propose is acts of localization constitute ostensive operations of tagging against an established address or coordinate system of varying dimensionality. So this address coordinate system could be anything from like the lookup table of a Turing machine automaton, or the 3-dimensional spatiotemporal visual field of a sentient system. But the idea is you have sensors which allow you to gather information, and you have these locators which are functions that basically tell you where to look in the environment to gather the relevant information. So by collecting measurements and indexing phenomena, a system progressively is able to produce what is called a map of its environment, in the sense of a nomological or structural double of the environment. And what, of course, what map is produced is going to be relative to its sensors and to its locator functions. And these maps could be anything from symbols in a page that is printed by a little robot to sounds that are made or whatever else, the grooves in a phonograph groove, et cetera, et cetera. And so in this regard, representation and localization is something that non-cognitive creatures can do, right? Like I just mentioned the example of the robot that scans its environment, and I don't know, it scans out and prints out maps which indicate the location of boxes and their sizes, because it's endowed with the right sensors and the right wiring diagram locators that give it the right instructions, and so on. At the second level, we have what is called simulation. And this is really where we enter the domain of sentient cognition proper. And this is where a system is able to integrate the information that is processed from its different sensor receptors and different locators into what is called a higher order global workspace, and which feeds these different sources of information into a common informational format. And it's this capacity of integrating varying sources and locators which produces as what we call a simulation of the environment. And this is, really a term that I borrow from Pete Wolfendale, but it's widely used in the literature. And at this level, systems do not only have representings of things, which even the robot can do by mapping it, but have consciousness of what they represent. And the perceptual psychologist and philosopher Susan Carey has distinguished in this regard a series of what are called input analyzers. And input analyzers are basically functions that sentient and sapient systems enjoy already from very early on in their developmental process that enable it to produce the kinds of representations that we associate with consciousness, namely those modular or sensory input analyzers, which enable the representations of sensations, and what she calls dedicated input analyzers, which are part of what she calls core cognition. And long story short, these two sets of functions enable us to have representations of spatial shapes, sizes, colors, but also proto-conceptual core cognitive representations of things like analog magnitudes, numbers, sets, objects, and many other things, actually. So it is at this moment in which we actually have something like an integral representation of ourselves and of our environments within it in a kind of integrated perceptual field. And this is also the moment in which systems migrate to be able to have a measure of control over their behavior. The philosopher Michael Tomasello has a very interesting story about how this is part of an evolutionary heuristic that you can observe in nature and in ape behavior more particularly. Now, at the third stage of the cognitive hierarchy, we have what is called material inference or rational classification proper. And this is where we enter the domain of sapient awareness. That is to say, discursive intelligence, where we have something like conceptual capacities. And this is not only the capacity to have consciousness of something, but to have consciousness of something as something. And what this essentially involves, long story short, is that we are capable of integrating the labels that we use to localize phenomena, say, the symbols that we print on a page in order to map boxes in the environment, into an order of what is called, in Saller's words, signification. That is to say, we're able to organize our symbols into inferential relationships of incompatibility and consequence. So the example I always give here is one must not only be able to respond to the presence of, say, red cats by producing the utterance red cat as per the right circumstances, but one must be able to integrate that label with others in a space of consequences, so as to be able to say, for example, there goes a red cat, and so not a dog, or there goes an animal, etc. And so conceptual competence requires these two things: being able to respond to environmental inputs reliably by classifying items within an integral simulation of the environment, localizing phenomena and oneself within it, and two, integrating such classificatory responses into inferential patterns within a quote-unquote space of reasons to describe and explain what one classifies. It's through conceptual behavior that we arrive at capacities for description and explanation. And it should be said that, concepts enable us to enhance the representational capacities that we obtain in the previous levels, since concepts themselves can function as locators, as indicating instructions for, in the sense of rules that enable us to localize phenomena in the environment. Now, at the third level, and I know I'm probably already reaching the end, so I'll try to rush a little bit. But so at the third level, we learn to make explicit patterns of material inference that are just implicit in our behavior in the form of rules. And this is done essentially through the use of logical vocabulary and paradigmatically subjunctive conditionals. So, in the inference, there goes a cat to there goes an animal, we make that explicit by formulating the conditional rule, if there goes a cat, there goes an animal, right? And this is something that we only obtain once we obtain logical vocabulary. And what's important to note is that this kind of formal reasoning is what enables us to engage in formal reasoning, deductive reasoning, and what to do essentially syllogistic reasoning. And it's a first way in which we learn to formalize our languages. Basically, organizing these rules in patterns of deduction. And it is at this level, Brandom argues, that we learn to merely entertain hypotheses and to engage in patterns of counterfactual reasoning, to explore possibilities that are not endorsed by embedding premises as the antecedents of conditionals that are unasserted components of compound assertions. So in the sentence, if there goes a cat, there goes an animal, I have not asserted there goes a cat. I'm just simply saying if, right? And this conditional rule means that it is through this kind of embedding that I am able to entertain a counterfactual or a hypothetical situation, right? So it allows me to abstract myself from the here and now to engage in this kind of space of deliberation. Now, here's where Brandon really stops. He has one more level, but it's an elaboration of this one. And what I want to do here is simply I escalate this hierarchy a few steps further, because beyond formal theory reasoning, we learn how to do theories. And this is, to me, an important breakthrough, which is the point in which we learn to systematically organize the formal rules of inference so as to produce a syntactic ideography in which a set of base rules or principles for axioms enable the deduction of every possible well-formed expression in the language, the theorems. So what this essentially involves is making transparent a semiotic system within which the symbols, the rules of formation and derivation, and the functional relation to a domain of interpretation are made explicit from the start. And basically, as theorization develops historically from its informal to its formal Hilbertian stage, one does not only learn to play with different syntactic systems and axiomatic principles and concepts of what constitutes an axiom, but learns techniques to formalize the relationship between mind and world by coordinating syntactic systems to what is called model structures. And this is exactly this is the advent of modern formal semantics, which is the way in which we interpret our syntactic systems by correlating them to structures or domains of interpretation. So this is precisely insofar as we can interpret our syntactic systems. That's what makes a formal system not just an abstract play on symbols, but it can be said to be coordinated to our descriptive and explanatory vocabularies, natural and scientific languages. And if formal inference enables us to make patterns of material inference explicit, theorization enables us to order and organize our formal inference so as to operationalize domains of inquiry, making their inferential structure globally explicit. And I'm almost done here. So at one stage even further, of course, we learn how to integrate theories into more comprehensive theories, so as to not only organize our different rules and axioms to explain phenomena in a single domain of interpretation, like Newtonian mechanics, but we can generate more expansive means, formal means, to bridge our explanatory accounts across domains and achieve a greater unity. So different theoretical mechanisms have played such a role. So algebra in the birth of modern science, set theory in the 19th century, information theory, category theory. And in systematic philosophy, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, it aspires to think the whole and not just a particular domain, this coincides with the birth of a second method beyond the axiomatic method, which is called the network coherence method, or the coherence network method. And essentially, I won't get into this right now because I'm clearly out of time. It's like this is basically a way to understand how it is that not only you can understand inferential structures that move from axioms to theorems in this deductive way, but inferences that behave cyclically. Finally, there is what I call the evaluation of the system, or natural reason, which is once you have developed your system and presumably integrated all these constituent theories within it, you can actually produce an epistemological assessment of the system. And this involves constructing a meta-theoretic lever that makes explicit how it is that the system can be evaluated with regard to the norm of truth or representational adequacy of the world. And this is where a Peircean perspective comes into play in my account by drawing from the work specifically of J. Rosenberg and Johannes Seib. And I will not, I'll just very briefly wrap up by saying that the way this essentially functions is through a qualitative and quantitative side. So on the qualitative side, basically, what you need to do is to be able to show how it is that across changing conceptual frameworks, you can isolate something that's structurally preserved that remains across these changing frameworks. And on the quantitative side, you have to be able to show how it is that these concepts are tied back to a measurement mechanism that you can diachronically then explain as theories develop are getting closer to an index. So in other words, what you do is you place theories diachronically and organize them and evaluate them through a meta-systematic approach that enables you to say that they are approaching a particular limit. And this is an approach that J. Rosenberg calls convergent realism, and which allows you to show that even though we do not yet know what the ultimate constituents of nature might be, what we can know is that we're getting closer. And he gives you a protocol for doing this kind of progressive escalation. So at this point, thinking as a whole makes itself explicit as a protocol for representing the world of which it is part through conceptual discursive means that are progressively elaborated and tested. And this is what I call natural reason, which is not just transcendental, but which is, as I mentioned at the beginning, a protocol for coordinating itself to the world of which it is part. So I'm sorry if I was too long. This is the diagram again. Hopefully that wasn't exceedingly too long. Thank you so much.
That was great. Unfortunately, we have to cut the Q&A because we don't have enough time. Due to time constraints, we will just have a pause now of almost 25 minutes, and then we will be back with the third panel. I say again, thanks to all panelists here, to Rico, Anna, Ben, and Daniel. That was great, and talk to you soon. Ciao for now.